Miss Vaughn set down the plate of biscuits she had brought to the small back room of the Willow Springs school and said, "Sergeant Ford, you are welcome to whatever you can eat." And Sergeant Ford, who was 71 and had ridden into Willow Springs the previous night on a slow buckskin mule, with a saddlebag of Army pension papers and a plain, honest history, took a biscuit and thanked her and asked her, plainly, at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in October, whether her maiden name had been Winter and whether she had once, at 20, corresponded with a lieutenant of the Third Cavalry called Reed Halloran. Miss Vaughn, who was 38 and had been widowed of the schoolmaster Elwin Vaughn for 6 years, set the biscuit plate down on the plank table very carefully. She said, "Sergeant Ford, my maiden name was Winter. I did correspond with Lieutenant Halloran between 1864 and 1866. He was killed in an Apache raid at Cimarron Springs in July of '66. I received the letter from his commanding officer at Fort Union 3 weeks later. I have his commanding officer's letter in the strongbox at my house." Sergeant Ford ate the biscuit. He said, "Ma'am, that letter was wrong." Miss Vaughn sat down slowly on the small plank bench opposite Sergeant Ford. She said, "Sergeant." Sergeant Ford said, "Ma'am, I was the sergeant on that patrol at Cimarron Springs. Lieutenant Halloran was my officer. We were ambushed by a small band of Apache. 3 of our men died in the raid. 2 were captured. Halloran was one of the captured. The commanding officer at Fort Union did not know they had been captured. He thought all 5 were dead. He wrote the plain, honest, wrong letter to your address at Willow Springs. He wrote the plain, honest, wrong letter to the family of the 4 other men also. He said, Halloran was held 4 years. He escaped in the summer of '70. He came back to Fort Union in the fall of '70, so Gaunt, his own aunt, would not have known him. He resigned his commission. He did not, ma'am, write to you, because he had learned by then that you had married a schoolmaster of Willow Springs and had a small daughter. He knew because he had asked a Denver friend to make discreet inquiry. He would not press on a married woman. He rode south. He has been at a small ranch on the Pecos in New Mexico territory the last 10 years. He is unmarried. He is 48. He runs a small, honest herd of 200 head. He said, I saw him in April of last year at the Veterans Reunion at Santa Fe. He asked me, plainly, whether I ever came through Willow Springs. I said I did, about once a year on my pension route. He asked me, plainly, whether I would give you his address. He said, if you were still married, he would not want it delivered. He said if by any chance you were not, and if any small part of you would still speak to a man you had thought dead 20 years, he would be plainly obliged if you knew where to find him. Sergeant Ford took a small folded paper from the inside pocket of his coat. He set it on the plank table. He said, Ma'am, I have carried this paper 18 months. I did not know if I would deliver it. I saw at the boarding hotel this morning that Elwin Vaughn of Willow Springs had died in '81 and that his widow taught the school. I have delivered it. It is now yours to do with. I have said my say. Miss Vaughn looked at the folded paper on the plank table. She said, Sergeant Ford. He said, yes. She said, please have another biscuit. He said, ma'am, I will. She read the address that night at her plank table by lamp. It said, Reed Halloran, Halloran Ranch, Post Office Pecos, Territory of New Mexico. She sat with the paper an hour. Then she wrote a plain, honest letter of 1 page. She said only that Sergeant Ford had ridden into Willow Springs on a Tuesday in October and had delivered his message and had eaten 3 biscuits. She said that her husband Elwin was 6 years in the ground, that her daughter Cora was 15 and at boarding school in Denver, that she was a widow of 38 teaching the small Willow Springs school. She said she had not, in 20 years, ever quite been able to accept that Reed Halloran was dead, even when she had held Fort Union's letter in her hand, and that she thought Sergeant Ford's message was in some way a plain, honest confirmation of what her heart had always plainly refused to believe. She said she would be honored to receive a reply, and would answer any reply plainly and honestly, and would leave any further arrangements to be decided by correspondence between 2 people who had, both of them, been 20 different people in the 20 years since '66. She signed her name plainly. Melissa Winter Vaughn, Willow Springs, Colorado. She mailed it on the Wednesday. The reply came on the 30th of November. Reed Halloran's letter was 3 pages. His handwriting was the plain, steady hand of a plain, honest cavalry officer who had, at 48, become a plain, honest, small rancher. He wrote plainly about the 4 years of his captivity, in the plain, honest, sparing way of a man who had thought about how to write it for 20 years. He wrote plainly about his 10 years on the Pecos. He wrote about the 200 head of his herd, and the small stone house he had built himself, and the plain, honest neighbor family who kept his kitchen when he was on the range. He wrote, plainly, that he had loved her at 20 and had never stopped and did not expect she had, and that the plain, honest arrival of her letter at his post office at Pecos had knocked him down at the age of 48 in a way that 4 years of Apache captivity and 10 years of the Pecos had not. He wrote that he would ride north in April when the passes cleared. He asked, plainly, whether she would receive him at Willow Springs at the boarding hotel. He would not press. He would come, sit at the small parlor of the boarding hotel over a cup of coffee, and, if she wished, walk out to her plank table for a supper. He signed his name plainly. Reed Halloran, Pecos, New Mexico Territory. They corresponded through the winter. His letters came every other Wednesday. Hers went back every other Sunday. His handwriting grew steadier. Hers grew warmer. Cora, in Denver, wrote her mother in March a plain, honest paragraph. Mother, I have thought about this. I do not need to think longer. Please receive Mr. Halloran in April. If you and Mr. Halloran come to what a plain, honest 16-year-old daughter can plainly see is inevitable, I will be pleased. Papa would have been pleased. He said so to me the summer before he died. Cora. Melissa framed the paragraph. Reed Halloran rode into Willow Springs on the 3rd Saturday of April, on a plain sorrel mare, with a plain leather saddlebag and one plain small traveling trunk. He tied at Mrs. Ansell's boarding hotel. He walked to the small back room of the school and knocked on the doorframe at 3:15 in the afternoon. Melissa Vaughn opened the door. He tipped his hat. She said, in a voice that surprised her by being steady, Reed Halloran. He said, in a voice that surprised him by being steady, Melissa Winter Vaughn. She said, please come in. There is coffee. He came in. There was coffee. He came out to her plank table for supper on Sunday. He came out on Wednesday. He came out on Saturday. Cora came home from Denver for the last week of April and met Reed Halloran at the plank table on the Wednesday, and, at the end of the supper, said to her mother in the kitchen, while Reed and Sergeant Ford, who had ridden back through Willow Springs for exactly this, were on the porch step, Mother, marry him, please. You will not need my permission. I am giving it anyway. Melissa said, Cora. Cora said, Mother. The circuit preacher married Reed Halloran and Melissa Winter Vaughn at the small Willow Springs Presbyterian Church on the last Sunday of May. Cora gave her mother away with her 15-year-old shoulders back. Sergeant Ford stood witness for Reed. Melissa's oldest friend, Nan Weller, stood witness for Melissa. The Fort Union commanding officer's letter of July of '66, plainly kept in Melissa's strongbox 20 years, was, on the day of the wedding, plainly burned by Melissa in her own parlor stove in the presence of Sergeant Ford and Nan Weller. Sergeant Ford, watching it burn, said, at last, Ma'am, 20 years of a plain, honest, wrong sentence just went up the chimney. Well done. Melissa said, well done us all, Sergeant. They moved into a small stone house Reed built at Willow Springs in the summer, because Melissa did not want to leave the Willow Springs school, and Reed had, plainly, at 48, come as far as he wanted to come. He sold his Pecos herd in June. He kept his Pecos house as a summer property. He and Melissa drove down to Pecos every June and every October to see the small neighbor family who had kept his kitchen for 10 years. Melissa taught them plainly to make her mother's biscuits. The neighbor family taught Melissa plainly to make their green child stew. 2 years on a warm September evening at the Halloran Stone House at Willow Springs, Melissa Halloran sat on the porch step with Reed beside her. Cora, 17, was in Denver at the Presbyterian College on a plain, honest scholarship. Sergeant Ford, 73, still riding his slow buckskin mule on his pension route, had stopped in the previous Wednesday and had eaten 5 biscuits. Reed said, "Melissa." Melissa said, "Reed." He said, "Sergeant Ford asked me at the plank table Wednesday whether I ever regretted the 4 years." Melissa said, "What did you tell him?" Reed said, "I told him no. I told him that the 4 years had made me a plain, honest, small rancher on the Pecos, who could sit on a porch step at 50 at a plank table, with the woman I had loved at 20, and that if you gave me a choice between the 4 years and any other 4 years of a plain, honest life without them, I would not know how to choose." Sergeant Ford said that was a plain, honest answer. He asked for a 5th biscuit. Melissa laughed once. She kissed her husband's temple. The pasture went to gold. Somewhere in the yard, the plain, honest neighbor cat Reed had brought up from Pecos was watching a plain, honest fence line for a plain, honest mouse. And Melissa Winter Vaughn Halloran, who had held Fort Union's plain, honest, wrong letter in her hand, at 20, in July of '66, and had accepted the plain, honest, wrong sentence in it, put her cheek against her husband's shoulder, and understood that the good, slow country had, in its good, slow way, arranged a plain, honest cavalry sergeant to eat 3 biscuits at a small back room of a Willow Springs school on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and had, on the strength of that plain, honest visit, given her back the boy she had loved at 20, and the whole rest of a plain, honest household at Willow Springs. No plain, honest, wrong letter of '66 could, on the plainer, honest measure of 20 years, have taken from her. And so it had.